On Father's Day, my son handed his father-in-law a shining Richard Mille wristwatch worth $9,000. The kind of watch that makes a room go silent with envy. The kind of watch people lift their phones to record, while when it came to me, he tossed a small plastic box into my lap with a smirk and said, "For you, Dad." Inside was nothing more than a rechargeable clipper. I smiled, I said thank you, and I let my silence do the talking, because I knew in that very moment that silence would teach him a lesson no words ever could. Thank you for watching and for giving me a moment of your time. It means more than you may ever know. And before I go on, I would like to ask you to tell me in the comments where you are watching from, because I always wonder how far my voice travels and whose heart it reaches. Now let me continue. Because that day when I held that little box with the clipper inside, I felt the weight of years pressing down on me. Years where I had given my strength, my sweat, and my heart to raise him into the man he had become. And yet, in front of everyone, my worth was measured by a cheap trinket while his father-in-law shined with a treasure strapped to his wrist. I sat there smiling, but inside I felt a cold ache spreading. Not because I wanted a watch or even expected anything grand, but because I saw in that gesture the measure of respect he placed on me. And it was small, so small it almost crushed me. I kept that smile on my face as everyone around the table clapped and admired the glittering watch. They leaned in to touch it, to ask about the price, to whisper about how generous my son was to the man he married into. And all the while I sat there quietly holding that small clipper in my hand, pretending that my heart was not breaking. I thought back to the nights when I worked double shifts just to make sure there was food on the table, to the times I patched his shoes so he could walk to school with dignity, to the mornings I went without breakfast so he could carry lunch in his bag, and I wondered how quickly those sacrifices had been forgotten. I remembered when he was young and he once gave me a card made with crayons, with shaky letters that read, "Best Dad in the World." And I had held that card like a treasure far greater than gold, because it came from love. But now what I held was a machine meant to trim hair, given without thought, without feeling, just something thrown together to say he had not come empty-handed. The pain was not about the object, it was about the meaning, about the way he saw me as less. And I realized that in that moment he was more concerned with impressing the rich man beside him than honoring the father who had carried him through storms. My silence that day was not weakness, it was a shield. Because if I had spoken, my anger would have poured out and my dignity would have been lost. So I chose instead to let them cheer and laugh, while I sat there thinking of the many roads I had walked to give him the life he now flaunted. When the dinner ended and the laughter faded, I walked slowly back home with that little clipper tucked under my arm, and the night air felt heavier than usual, not because of the gift itself, but because of what it revealed about where I stood in his heart. And as I sat down in my chair and placed the box on the table, I let my mind drift back through the years, and memories came rushing in like a flood that would not stop. I saw myself as a younger man, waking before the sun to head out for work, my hands rough and calloused from lifting, building, and sweating day after day, all so that my son could have shoes on his feet, books in his bag, and a chance at a life better than mine. I remembered the nights when bills piled high, and I had to choose which one could wait and which one I would pay. And I always chose the one that would keep the lights on so he could study, because I believed in his future even when mine looked uncertain. I remembered how many times I walked home from work with tired legs, only to be greeted by his smile at the door, a smile that made every ache disappear. And I remembered how he once told me, "Dad, when I grow up, I'll take care of you the way you take care of me." And I believed him. I held on to those words. They kept me going when life seemed unbearable. As I sat in that silence, the house felt empty, and the walls seemed to echo with all the sacrifices that had been made within them. Every nail hammered into the beams, every corner painted with my sweat, every meal cooked with whatever little I had left. I thought of his mother, my late wife, how she worked beside me, how she prayed over him, how she believed that raising him with love would come back to us as love in return. And I wondered what she would think if she had been alive to see that moment. Her son lifting up another man as the symbol of success, while handing his own father a box that carried not pride, not honor, but neglect. The pain of that thought cut deeper than the gift itself, and I sat there in the quiet, staring at the unopened clipper, realizing that in that instant I had become invisible in my own family's eyes, useful only as a shadow in the corner, not as the man who once stood strong to hold everything together. But even as the sadness settled, something else began to grow inside me, something sharper and stronger than words, a kind of resolve that did not need shouting, because I understood that respect cannot be begged for, it cannot be demanded, it is shown in the way people treat you without being asked. My silence that day was not surrender. It was a decision, and as I leaned back in that chair, I felt the weight of wisdom pressing on me, telling me that there are times when silence speaks louder than anger, and that sometimes a father must step aside, not to disappear, but to let the truth reveal itself. I thought about the land outside, the house built brick by brick, the savings I had guarded, and I knew that what I had built would not be left to someone who could not even see my worth on the day meant to honor fathers. In that quiet, I began to see a path forming, not out of revenge but out of justice, a path that would ensure that my legacy would reach the hearts that still loved me sincerely, the grandchildren who still hugged me without asking what I could give them, the ones whose eyes lit up when I entered the room. That night, I made myself a promise. I would not raise my voice, I would not cause a scene, I would let my silence carry the weight of my decision, and when the time came, he would understand that a father's silence can shape a future more powerfully than any lecture or any gift. And as I finally rose from my chair and turned off the light, I whispered into the darkness, not to him but to myself. Respect is not bought with watches, it is earned in the way you treat those who gave you everything. And with that I went to bed, carrying a silence that was no longer weakness, but the beginning of something far greater. The next morning, when the sun came up and light crept through the window, I sat with a cup of coffee in my hand and looked again at that little box on the table, untouched and unopened. And I thought about how quickly one moment can reveal the truth about years of sacrifice. I did not feel anger as much as I felt clarity, because when someone shows you what you mean to them, you must believe it. And that day, my son had shown me exactly where I stood. I thought of the many times I went without sleep so he could rest easy, the times I put my own needs aside so he would never feel the sting of lack. And I realized that while I gave him everything, he had learned to give his honor to someone else, to a man who had not raised him, who had not carried him through sickness, or walked the long road of struggle beside him. It hurt in a way that words cannot capture, because what I saw in his eyes was not pride in his father but shame, as if I were a reminder of the life he wanted to escape, and that shame cut deeper than any insult spoken aloud. I sat there for hours thinking about what silence can do, because silence is not emptiness, it is a mirror, and in silence, people are forced to face themselves. I decided I would not argue, I would not demand his respect, I would not cry out for recognition. Instead, I would place my silence like a stone in his path, heavy and unmovable, until he felt its weight every time he walked past. That morning, I rose from my chair and dressed slowly, each button fastened with thought, and I walked down to the office of the lawyer who had helped me through the years with small matters, land papers, and accounts. I sat across from him, and I spoke plainly, not with bitterness but with certainty, and I told him it was time to rewrite my will. I explained that everything I had built, the house, the land, the savings, would no longer be tied to the one who could not see my worth, but instead it would pass to the grandchildren who still climbed into my lap, who still drew me pictures with their little hands, who still saw me as someone who mattered. The lawyer looked at me with surprise, perhaps expecting hesitation, but there was none, because my heart had already decided. As he drew up the new papers, I felt a calmness wash over me, not the calm of defeat, but the calm of a man reclaiming his dignity. I signed my name slowly, each stroke of the pen carrying the weight of years, and when it was done, I felt a strange relief, as if I had spoken without saying a word. I left his office and walked back home, and as I entered my quiet house, I placed the folded copy of the will inside a drawer beside the clipper. One object speaking of disrespect, the other of justice. And I knew that in time those two would tell a story far louder than anything I could say with my voice. Days passed quietly after that decision, and though the house felt the same, inside me something had changed. Because now, every time I looked at those papers in the drawer, I felt a strength that words alone could never give. And I knew I had taken back the power that had been stripped from me in front of others. I went about my days as I always had, tending to the small tasks that kept my life steady. But behind every simple act there was a new calm, a calm that came from knowing my future, my legacy, my life's work would not be wasted in the hands of someone who could not even find the respect to honor me on the day set aside for fathers. I thought often of the look on his face when he handed me that clipper, a smirk so casual, as if he believed that I would always accept whatever scraps of attention he offered, and that memory only deepened my resolve. Because I realized that by staying silent, I had left him to wrestle with his own conscience. It was not long before whispers began to circle through the family, and I could see the unease in his eyes when he visited briefly and found me calm, quiet, and distant. He asked questions that seemed harmless at first, about the land, about the accounts, about whether I had been to see anyone lately. But I answered little, and instead of the arguments he expected, I gave him only silence, and that silence unsettled him more than anger ever could. My grandchildren continued to visit me with their laughter and their hugs, unaware of the storm that was slowly forming, and in their innocence I found comfort, because their love reminded me why I had made the choice I did. I told myself that one day, when they were older, they would understand that everything I had built had not been lost to greed, but protected by silence. As the weeks turned into a month, I began to notice how often the phone rang with his number, flashing across the screen. First once in a while, then more often, until the ringing became a daily echo in my quiet house. I let it ring, sometimes watching the light blink until it faded, because every unanswered call was another reminder that he had finally begun to feel the weight of what my silence carried. He had given his honor to another man in front of the world, and now he realized that the man he had dismissed with a smirk held something more valuable than any luxury watch could ever buy. My silence had become the one thing he could not ignore, and I sat with it, patient and steady, knowing that the lesson was only just beginning. The more the phone rang unanswered, the more his voice began to change in the messages he left behind. At first they were casual, almost careless, as if he believed he could brush everything aside with a few words, saying things like, "Dad, I'll come by soon. I've been busy. I'll make it up to you." But when the silence stretched longer, those words turned into questions, and then into pleading, and I could hear the cracks forming in his pride. He would say, "Dad, I heard something. People are talking. They're saying you changed things with the lawyer. Tell me it isn't true." And though I sat in my chair listening, I gave him nothing back. Not even a single word. Because the truth did not need to be explained. It needed to be felt, and silence was the only way he would feel it. I watched him shift from confidence to worry, from worry to panic, and each time he called, I remembered the look on his face that day when he lifted the wrist of another man as if it carried his honor while tossing me a small box as if I were nothing. I remembered how everyone clapped for him while I sat there quietly, and now those claps had turned into echoes that followed him, because the same people who cheered were now whispering behind his back, asking why his own father no longer answered his calls. His discomfort became my lesson to him, and I knew it reached deeper than any scolding could have, because when a man begins to fear losing what he once took for granted, that fear reshapes him more than anger ever could. The grandchildren continued to come around, innocent and joyful, asking me to tell them stories, drawing me little pictures with crayons, hugging me tight as though nothing in the world had changed. And it was in those moments I felt a peace that reminded me I had made the right choice. They loved me not for what I had, not for what I could give, but simply for who I was. And that love is what deserved to inherit what I had built with my hands and my years. So while the phone rang and his messages grew longer and heavier with regret, I sat surrounded by the only proof I needed. Proof that silence was not an empty act, but a shield, a voice of its own, one that told him clearly that respect once lost cannot be bought back with apologies spoken too late. One evening, as I sat in my chair listening to the steady tick of the old clock on the wall, I played back his latest message, his voice trembling in a way I had not heard since he was a boy. He said, "Dad, please answer me. I can't sleep. I keep hearing that you went to the lawyer, that you changed everything. I don't know if it's true, but if it is, please, let's talk." I sat there with my hands folded, staring at the unopened clipper still resting in the drawer beside the will, and I thought about how those two things together told the story better than I ever could. One spoke of disrespect, a careless gesture that cut me deep, and the other spoke of justice, a decision made in silence that would echo far beyond me. He was beginning to realize what silence meant. He was beginning to taste the bitterness of his own choices, and though a part of me longed to remind him of all I had given, I resisted, because I knew words would only dull the lesson. And what he needed was to sit with the truth until it sank into his bones. I remembered sitting in that lawyer's office weeks before, the way the pen felt in my hand as I signed my name on the papers, the certainty that flowed through me when I looked the lawyer in the eye and told him my estate would go to the grandchildren. There had been no anger in my voice, only resolve, because this was not about punishment. It was about preserving dignity. It was about ensuring that what I built with my bare hands would live on in the hearts of those who still loved me without conditions. That memory returned to me as I listened to his voice break down on the machine, because in that moment I understood that he was now the one losing sleep. He was now the one sitting in silence, waiting for a response that never came. Each day that passed seemed to press harder on him. I could see it in the way he came by unannounced, standing awkwardly in the doorway when I opened the door just enough to greet my grandchildren, but not him. And I could see the questions in his eyes, questions he was afraid to ask directly. Questions like, "Am I still your son in your heart, or have I lost that place forever?" I did not answer. I simply turned my attention to the little ones who rushed into my arms, and in doing so I gave him the clearest answer he could ever receive. He lingered at the edge of the room, shifting his weight from foot to foot, trying to find the courage to speak, but my silence wrapped around him like a shadow, forcing him to feel the emptiness his own actions had created. I thought of the many times I had lifted him from the ground when he fell as a child, wiped the dirt from his knees, and told him to stand tall again. And now here he was, a grown man, brought low not by accident, but by his own choices, standing in front of me hoping that I would once again lift him up. But I stayed still, because I knew that this fall was not mine to mend. It was his to learn from, and only silence could teach him the weight of respect denied. In the quiet of those days, I found myself thinking often of his mother, of how she had always believed in forgiveness, and I wondered if I was being too harsh. But then I remembered her words she whispered to me long ago. "Love must come with respect. Without it, love is only a shadow." And with those words echoing in my mind, I knew I was honoring her memory not by giving in, but by standing firm. The phone calls did not stop. The messages grew longer, filled with apologies, promises, even tears. But I remained steady, because I understood that a wound so deep could not be patched with quick words. It needed time. It needed silence to carve the lesson into him. And so I let the phone ring. I let the messages play, and I let the silence stretch on, because sometimes silence is not the absence of love. It is the presence of truth. And the truth was that on the day meant to honor fathers, he had chosen to honor another man while belittling his own. And that choice had consequences he never imagined. My silence was not revenge. It was the mirror he now had to face. And in that mirror, he saw what he had thrown away with a single careless act. The silence stretched into weeks, and each day it seemed to grow heavier on him, because the more I withheld my words, the more desperate his became. And soon his messages were no longer just apologies, but confessions of fear. He said things like, "Dad, I was wrong. I see it now. I should never have treated you that way. I don't know what I was thinking. Please talk to me." And though his voice shook with regret, I still let the silence stand between us, because some lessons cannot be rushed. They must burn slowly, until the one who caused the wound feels the weight of their own actions. I knew that if I answered too soon, if I gave him comfort without reflection, the pain of that Father's Day would fade from his mind, and he would return to the same path. So I chose to let him sit in the emptiness his choices had created. There were times when I sat alone in the evening listening to the clock tick, remembering the pride in his eyes as a little boy when he brought me his school papers, eager for my praise. And I thought about how far those eyes had drifted, clouded now by the hunger to impress another man instead of honoring the one who raised him. I told myself over and over that silence was not cruelty. It was the only voice strong enough to cut through his pride, and with each day that passed, I could feel it working. Because when he came by the house unannounced, he no longer carried himself with the same swagger. Instead, he stood at the door with his head lowered, asking if he could come in. And when I stepped aside to greet my grandchildren and not him, his shoulders sank further. I felt a mixture of sorrow and strength watching him unravel. Sorrow because no father ever dreams of teaching such a lesson to his own son. But strength because I knew it was the only way to protect the value of everything I had sacrificed for. I thought often of the will tucked safely away, my quiet promise that the ones who still showed me love would inherit not just the land and the house, but the truth of who I was. And that thought gave me peace, because it meant my life's work would not be cheapened by ungratefulness. And so I let the silence carry on, day after day, call after call, because I had come to understand that silence is not the absence of words. It is the presence of justice. And it was justice that he was finally beginning to feel. One Sunday afternoon, when the sky was heavy with clouds and the air carried the smell of rain, he came again. But this time he did not come alone. He brought his wife with him, and I could see from the window the nervous way he held her arm as they walked up to my door, as if he needed her presence to hold himself steady. I did not rush to open. I let them wait a little, because silence has many forms, and sometimes it is felt even before a word is spoken. When I finally turned the handle and pulled the door open, my grandchildren rushed past them and into my arms, their laughter filling the house the way sunlight fills a dark room. And I bent down to kiss their cheeks, holding them close while their parents stood stiff at the doorway. My son cleared his throat and said quietly, "Dad, can we talk?" And I looked at him without answering, then turned and led the little ones inside. His wife's eyes darted around, searching for a sign of welcome, but I gave her none, and the silence hung heavy between us like a storm that refused to break. Inside the house, I sat in my chair with the children gathered around me, showing me their drawings, and I felt their joy washing over me like a balm. But in the corner of my eye, I saw him standing uncertain, waiting for me to invite him closer, waiting for words that never came. He shifted from foot to foot, finally blurting out, "Dad, I know I made a mistake. I know what I did hurt you, but please, I need to explain." And yet, even as he spoke, I remained calm, listening but not answering, because silence was the answer he had earned. His wife nudged him, urging him on, and he said, "I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought it mattered to honor my father-in-law in front of everyone. I didn't mean to disrespect you. I didn't think about how it looked. I was wrong." His words filled the room like water pouring from a broken vessel, spilling fast and messy, but I did not move. I kept my eyes on the drawings in my hand, on the love of the grandchildren who had never once made me feel invisible. The silence pressed on him harder with each passing second, and I could see his shoulders begin to slump, his voice faltering as he whispered, "Dad, please, don't leave me out. I heard what you did at the lawyer's office. I know about the will. Please don't shut me out forever." His voice cracked then, and the pride that once carried him in front of crowds was gone, stripped away until all that remained was a man facing the weight of his own choices. I looked at him finally, meeting his eyes, and for the first time in a long while I saw fear there. Not the fear of losing money or status, but the fear of losing a father's love. And in that moment, I knew the silence had done what words could not. I leaned back in my chair, still quiet, and let the rain begin to fall against the windows, each drop marking the passing of a truth he could no longer escape. He stood there waiting, every second heavier than the last, and though part of me ached to release him from his torment, I remembered the way he smirked on that Father's Day, the way he raised the hand of another man with pride while tossing me a box that spoke of disregard. That memory burned, and I let it keep me steady, because forgiveness too quickly given can cheapen the lesson, and the lesson needed to last. My silence filled the room until it became unbearable for him, and finally he turned away, his wife guiding him out as he muttered, "I'm sorry, Dad. I'll keep trying." The door closed softly behind them, but even as they left, the silence remained, a living thing that followed him out into the rain, a reminder that some wounds cannot be healed by words alone, only by the weight of truth settling slowly into the heart. The days after that visit felt different, not because I had spoken, but because I had not, and I knew that my silence had followed him home, weighing on him with every mile he drove. The calls did not stop, in fact they grew more frequent, and his voice in the messages carried less pride and more desperation. He would say things like, "Dad, please answer me. I'll do anything. I can't lose you like this." And though a part of me felt the sting of pity, I reminded myself that pity was not the same as respect, and respect was what had been broken on that Father's Day. I moved through my days as always, rising with the sun, walking through the yard, fixing small things around the house, and in those quiet tasks I found strength, because each nail I hammered, each floorboard I polished, reminded me that everything here had been built by my hands, not his, and it was mine to decide where it went when I was gone. Sometimes when the grandchildren came, they would ask why their father looked so sad lately, and I would simply smile and say, "He is learning something important," because I knew that one day they would understand. They climbed into my lap with their laughter, placing their small drawings in my hands, and I felt in those moments that my decision was right. Because love that is pure, love that is free of pride, deserves to carry forward what I leave behind. At night, when the house was still, I would sit in my chair and listen to the ticking clock, and I thought often about the difference between noise and silence, how noise fills the air but disappears quickly, while silence sinks into the bones and stays, shaping a man from the inside out. My son had given me noise that day with his careless gesture, but I had given him silence, and now it was silence that was shaping him. He tried again to come by the house one evening, standing at the gate longer than usual, but I did not move to meet him. I let him wait until finally he turned away, shoulders bent, and I knew the lesson was still burning. My heart was heavy, because no father dreams of teaching his son this way. Yet I also felt calm, because I understood that some truths cannot be taught with kind words. They must be lived. They must be endured. My silence was no longer just mine. It had become his too, and I knew he carried it with him wherever he went. A reminder that respect, once lost, cannot be bought back with gifts. It must be rebuilt. And until he understood that, my silence would remain unbroken. One night when the air was heavy and the house was quiet, I sat alone with the lights dimmed and thought about everything that had passed. The phone still buzzing with his calls, the messages piling up, and the silence between us stretching like a wall neither of us could climb. I thought back to the moment at that lawyer's desk when I signed the new will, and I felt no regret, only certainty, because I knew I had placed my trust where love was still alive. My grandchildren, without knowing it, had become the true keepers of my legacy, because they gave without expecting, they honored me without shame, and they never tried to measure me by what I could give. As I sat there, I remembered the look on my son's face when he begged at the doorway, eyes filled with the fear of losing what he thought was his right. And I knew the silence was working. It was stripping away his pride piece by piece until only the truth remained. He wanted my words, but words would have let him escape too easily, and so I let the silence continue, as heavy and unrelenting as the years I carried him on my shoulders. The weeks that followed grew heavier for him, and I could see the change each time he came near, because the man who once stood tall with his chest puffed out now looked smaller, worn down by the weight of not being answered. His wife no longer carried the same smug smile. She looked at me with something closer to fear, perhaps realizing that the wealth and comfort she imagined tied to her husband's name could slip away with a stroke of my pen, and maybe she had already guessed that it had. The silence had spread like a shadow over their home, and it followed them wherever they went. And though I took no joy in their suffering, I felt a certain justice in it, because sometimes silence is not only for the one who caused the wound, but for those who watched and encouraged it too. I remembered the laughter at that table when the watch was presented, the admiration, the whispers, and how I sat invisible in the corner, and I understood that my silence now was the echo of that humiliation, turned back on them. They had thought me small, but in silence I had grown larger than they expected, and now they had no choice but to face me. It all came to a turning point when word of the will became more than rumor, when family members began to ask questions, when whispers spread that I had chosen differently, and I saw the panic in his eyes grow deeper. He came once more, this time alone, standing before me with tears welling, his voice shaking as he said, "Dad, please, don't shut me out. I don't care about the money. I care about you. I can't bear the thought of losing you." And though his words finally sounded like the truth, I stayed silent still, because it was not enough to say the right things. He needed to live them, to prove them, to carry them beyond a moment of fear. Silence had become my teacher, my shield, my weapon, and my comfort, and I could see in his trembling hands that it had become his too, pressing him to change in ways that words never could. The house was quiet except for the ticking clock and his broken voice, and I felt the weight of years pressing down on us both. Father and son, locked in a battle where no shouting could win, only silence could. And in those quiet days that followed, I realized something greater. That silence is not only about teaching others, it is also about protecting yourself. For too long, I had carried the burden of trying to be seen, trying to be respected, trying to remind him of the sacrifices I had made, but now I saw clearly that I no longer needed to prove anything. My life, my house, my land, my years of labor already told the story, and those who truly loved me already knew it without explanation. My silence was not only for him, it was for me. A way of stepping back into dignity, a way of keeping my peace intact. I had given him everything I could, and when he chose to place his honor in another man's hands, I chose to place my silence in his, and now it was that silence that haunted him. A silence he could not escape, a silence that would teach him the value of respect in a way nothing else could. And as I sat once more in my chair, listening to the phone ring, I knew that whether he changed or not, I had already reclaimed my strength, and my silence had already spoken louder than anything I could ever say. Now my son cannot stop calling, his pride stripped away, and his heart restless, because he finally understands that a father's silence can be louder than applause, sharper than anger, and heavier than rejection. I sit here in my quiet house with the will tucked safely away, the laughter of my grandchildren still fresh in my ears, and I feel no bitterness, only peace, because I know my life's work is safe in hands that carry love without condition. He thought a gift could measure my worth. He thought status could replace respect. But he has learned that true wealth is not in what you buy. It is in the honor you show to those who carried you when you had nothing. And so I let my silence do the talking. And in that silence I have found my strength, my justice, and my answer. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of my story. It means more than I can say. And if my words touched your heart, I invite you to subscribe so we can walk together through more truths still to come.